You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So, Kutter, thank you so much for stopping what you're doing and taking the time to talk to us about your book, Watching TV Religiously, Television and Theology in Dialogue. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Yourself?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you. So, before I ask the first question, I do want to express, I read this book going to and fro on a plane, and all I can say is I had no idea how complex a subject TV can be. I was going, man, I hope I don't ever get tested on this, because I would do poorly. It's pretty complex, really.
I thought you were going to say you didn't feel comfortable because I opened with a story about the show Lost and the plane disappearing. So, you're going to advise people not to read it on a plane.
I did think about that. That's funny. The first question really is kind of that same genre, I guess. Can you start by explaining a bit about your book and what you expect or expected it to achieve?
Sure. Probably at its core, I would hope, or at least my goal, one of them was to demonstrate or to sort of show people the process that I go through anytime I'm in the act of engaging culture theologically. And really what that means is a number of things, and as you said, sometimes they can get kind of complex. But at a very basic level, it's really just trying to ask the question of where is God involved in this thing, whatever that thing is. And in this case, it's television. And to ask that question, or at least to kind of make any forward movement and maybe answering it, it requires a number of things for us to do. And one is to find a way to understand television, in this case, on its own terms, to let it kind of set the agenda for the conversation, and including our own sort of response and what we make of it theologically. And to do that, I'm of the impression that we actually need to become skilled interpreters of this cultural product itself. And so in this case, it's television, which means it's not a movie, it's not pop music, it's not a drama or theater, it's its own thing. And even that thing is, as you said, emerging and changing and morphing and sort of blurring the boundaries between all sorts of different media. And that's really just part of the process. For us to be, I think, responsible interpreters of culture, we need to actually know what it is we're talking about, and that sometimes requires us to do a bit of homework. And so I think if anything else, it was to say, hey, let's find a way. Here's some avenues, some tools that readers might be able to latch on to be able to say, okay, I've now watched, Friends, or I've watched Lost, or I've watched whatever the newest, latest, greatest TV show is, and I'm able to speak competently about that show in a way that is sincere, but also is not sort of reading into it or critiquing it out of hand, that sort of thing. That is often the case, I think, with Christian interpreters, but people in general nowadays. We have this sort of social media sense that we've got an opinion, and because we've got an opinion, everyone else should hear that opinion. And often those opinions are really uninformed and sometimes even dangerous. But at the very least, they're just uninformed. And just because you have an uninformed opinion doesn't mean that it's of equal merit or value as to others who have thoughtfully engaged something. And so that really was my goal. How do we thoughtfully engage this cultural product, this cultural artifact? And then from there, how do we kind of forge a theological response?
Absolutely. You brought up that TV is not a movie, and you addressed that in the book, but I found that really, really interesting, and it goes along with people's opinion. Is most people, I think even today, still try to compare it to movies, and it's a completely different creature, right?
Yeah. That's one of the things that, like any sort of emerging technology or storytelling form, there's obviously overlap. And there are some ways in which the lines are blurred. So what does it mean to watch a movie that you watch on TV or on Netflix, right? What does it mean when a TV series, quote unquote, is really kind of a number of long, well-produced movies? I don't know if you're familiar with the show Sherlock. It's a BBC show. Not a super long run. I think only 5 seasons, and each season was, I want to say either 3 or 6 episodes, and they were each about 90 minutes long. They were a full feature-length movie in their own right, but they were serialized. At the same time, they were self-contained. You could watch it. So they're kind of like movies. And nowadays, with the money that's in television, the quality is equal to movies. In some cases, surpasses movies. And so there's certainly this overlap in the forms, but it still is different to say, what are we doing when we sit down in front of our television or in front of our iPhone and watch this show versus go to a theater and watch some spectacular film. I think of I don't know if you saw The Greatest Showman, which is a movie that got panned by some critics, but I just thoroughly enjoyed. I set my cinephile card aside, and it was because it was on the big screen. It was this musical. It was this production. A totally different experience on my iPhone. Whereas last night, I watched an episode of The Daily Show, and my wife watched an episode of The Good Wife for 20 minutes on the couch together with our headphones on. So
that's interesting.
So I mean, these are very different encounters, very different experiences, and just acknowledging those differences is, I think, an important in terms of us understanding. Okay, not just what does the thing mean, but also how does it mean? How does it sort of take up residence in our lives in meaningful ways?
Right. That kind of what you just brought up about watching shows separately but together. It kind of complicates the next question that I'm going to incorporate that into the question. And you started in your book explaining the early years of TV, and back when people were first watching it, how they would do household chores while they were watching TV. And then you got into how a lot of people today surf or text while watching, and not even just texting on their phones. I mean, the TV actually makes it readily available for you to engage with the sports activity or TV show or whatever it is, or even politics. I guess it's crazy, but I read studies probably a few years back on TV where they were saying it was a completely passive activity. But of course, like with a lot of those science studies, they, just like, well, this is bad for you, but they gave the mouse, 4 pounds of it at once and it died. And like, see?
Yeah.
And with TV, it was kind of, sit still, watch this, and we're going to put electrodes on your head. Yeah. So they said the brain activity was almost totally passive. But now you have both that side of things as well as people watching something together but not together. How does all that, I mean, is that a good tool or a bad tool, an indifferent tool? What is that?
Yeah, well, I'm of various minds on this. This is where it gets complicated, right? That's the answer, I think, in truth. It just depends, right? I mean, are we talking adults? Or are we talking children? Are we talking a group of people? Or are we talking an isolated individual? And is that individual a teenager who is removing herself from her family to go and binge watch something, because she doesn't want to be with her family? Or is it that all of the friends in her network are passionate fans of whatever Jessica Jones season 2 just came out, and it's like, we want to go and watch this together and be tweeting each other, and it's actually driving me toward community, even though I'm sort of separating myself off from these other forms. So it really depends, I think, both on the practices that are involved, the content of the shows involved, and then the sort of intentionality of the individuals, of the people, and even more broadly of the community. So, for example, I'll watch stuff with my daughters. They're all young, 7, 5, and 2. And there'll be some things I let them watch on their own, but for the most part, I want to be involved in their viewing habits. We don't have broadcast television in my home. We don't have cable or anything like that. We only have streaming stuff, so they can stream PBS Kids and these other shows. And when we do, as a family, kind of watch a program together, I see that as a point for me as a parent to come alongside and say, let's talk about it. What was the content we viewed? Was some of it unhelpful, right? Was some of it actually stuff we would want to model or emulate? So at no point am I just imagining my kids are going to go sit in front of a TV show and I could walk away thinking, okay, this is either good or bad, right? The good or badness is probably related more to my parenting in that scenario. Same thing with my own TV viewing habits. I used my wife as a sort of barometer because, man, I'll watch just dark stuff all day long if given, and she has sort of is a bit more sensitive to that, especially to like violence and stuff. And if I didn't have her kind of cautioning me, I think I'd probably develop unhealthy habits. But simply by the fact that I'm with her and I kind of turn to her at times to say, hey, would you want to watch this show? If she's saying no, I then say, okay, maybe for me right now that's not healthy. That's not good. So it really is not a straightforward answer. However, I will say in terms of your question about community is that it, like times before, when I wrote in the book, people did stuff, they were distracted, but then also there were these moments where television, because it was mostly live, really did gather people together. And there are still instances where that happens and are interesting. I mean, the Super Bowl is a good example. Live sports, the Olympics, for example, things that people really say, oh, there's some value in us gathering together with others to engage in this TV viewing habits. Can I think really be constructive in some ways, and doesn't have to necessarily be, just mindless and passive entertainment. That being said, there is some mindless passive entertainment. Most of the summer reality TV shows to me fall into that category. I'm not savvy enough to get it, but I'm like, I don't get Big Brother. I just, there are a bunch of people in a house and watch them fight with each other. That doesn't seem all that stimulating to me. So there are certainly cases where I would say it's breeding passivity and may not be ideal for people to engage.
Right. That brings up another interesting thought I just had when you were talking about darker television, and Jessica Jones definitely would fall in that category.
Yeah. So, another one that my wife actually couldn't watch. We watched a couple episodes, and she's like, "I can't do it." And I said, "Okay, I'll pause. I'm not gonna go there."
Right.
Anyway, go on.
So with that being said, Christians have struggled with this from theater 200 years ago to present days. You're watching something dark, but I guess there's moments of redemptive activity in those. It's usually the last 10 seconds at the end. But is that kind of interaction with something like that one of those, I guess, Francis Schaeffer moments where you're enjoying the artfulness of how they put it together, and more so and then you're praying for the soul of the person that wrote it? Or how do you enjoy something like that?
Well, similar to your last question, I don't think there's a way to say here's the recipe, right? Like there's a recipe that you input this and out comes a good way to do it, right? Or the right way to do it, because so much depends upon the sort of sensibilities and sensitivities to the person. So all of us have different inclinations and different things that. I don't even want to couch it in moral terms, but even just triggering events. Some of us have past histories of things that we watch a particular show and it's sort of re-traumatizing and unhealthy. But it also could be that it's sort of tapping into inner motives or desires that we would rather not really entertain. However, I'm also of the impression that Christians should be everywhere. And I mean, quite literally everywhere. Now, there there are points where you go, okay, well, even if you're there, you need to be the staunch sort of representative of the alternative option. And that's very clear. But I think, that if our calling really is to incarnate the gospel, that it's some of those darkest places that the gospel needs to be. And that includes both the creators of these shows. And so part of the conversation is not just what do you watch, but how are you interacting with the TV creators, right? But then when it comes down to just what do I watch, it really, I think, depends upon who you are and where God has sort of situated you. So a story I tell often, and actually when I was pastoring, I got in trouble for it from my congregation, but it was basically a sermon on why everyone should watch South Park, or why all Christians should. And it was tongue-in-cheek. I didn't mean everyone should, but it was just a story of when I used to work at an unnamed coffee shop that may have thousands of locations around the United States. And I had a good friend there that I developed a friendship with, and he loved South Park. And part of my, I don't want to say strategy, but part of my ability to relate to him was my ability to talk in the language of South Park, to reference those shows, to have a conversation with him that demonstrated, hey, I care about you and who you are and what you care about. And it really was, I think, a moment of growth for me as a Christian to say, what will I entertain and what will I endure? Now, for the most part, South Park doesn't have anything that's going to, now it affects me because everything affects me, but there wasn't any content in there that's going to be sort of destructive spiritually to me, even though there's a lot of content in there that nobody should really be watching. If you're just going to say, is this a Christian show? Absolutely not. But in kids, not at all, But for me, it was really this insight into, one, I want to understand who this human being is that I work with every day. But then also it was sort of the early sort of murmurings in my own heart of like, oh, by watching the show, this also gives me insight into more than just this individual. There's a broader sort of cultural zeitgeist or spirit or sensibility that by interacting with these stories, I'm able to tap into and understand those who may not be a part of the Christian community in a way that otherwise I really wouldn't have access to that. And so that's at least my approach. Now, what that doesn't mean is that I watch everything. It doesn't mean that anybody should watch everything, but it does mean I think we can be strategic about the kinds of darkness, quote unquote, if you will, the kinds of content that we will endure and go through for those sort of purposes. And so that's sort of my approach to it. But again, as I mentioned, there's a risk involved, and that is I know myself well enough, and I continue to get to know myself better, and that is I have to admit there are times when I watch too much, and I stop and go, oh, yeah, that was unhealthy. I shouldn't have. That was not a constructive show or episode or whatever, and I need to go back. And this would be similar to anything in life where you say, okay, what kind of safeguards am I putting into place to ensure that I'm engaging this in a healthy and with integrity?
Right. That's definitely what you need to do. Although, I suppose in your case, you could say it was research for the second book, right?
Oh, man, I use that excuse all the time. And you know what? And to be honest, it's an excuse sort of, but it's also true. I mean, part of my role, both as sort of a professor and then sort of an author in this field, is I do kind of see myself as a curator of sorts, right? That part of my task is to wade through the muddy waters to help people know where to go, right? So they don't have to waste their time or take the same risks that maybe I would. Or if they are going to take the risks, to do it with eyes wide open, to know, hey, here's the value of this, but man, you're going to have to go through a whole lot to get there. So I believe in the book, I'm now, I can't remember if I wrote it in an online piece or if it's in the book about True Detective. That's in the book, right? Does that come to mind?
I think so.
And it's an HBO show, so it's it's definitely rated TVMA. It's a profound sort of like spiritual horror / detective show, very dark, very nihilistic. The whole time you're thinking, and Matthew McConaughey plays a character that's sort of a philosophical nihilist, the whole time you're just thinking this is going to be bad, right? It's just all bad, all dark, and I loved every minute of it, right? And so, but at the end, you get, and this is why I would say I think this is a valuable show to watch. This is if you're not too triggered by some of these things, this is a valuable show to watch, because at the end, you've got McConaughey and his name's Rusty, and his partner's name it's escaping me, but they've gone through just this horrific sort of case and encountered just some really grisly things, and the nihilist. McConaughey's character is in a wheelchair, having endured all this, and they're outside the hospital talking, sort of the final point of the show. They're looking up at the sky, and he says, it really looks like darkness is overwhelming. And this is my summary. This isn't exactly what he says, but and he goes, and as I look at it, it's true. There's a lot of darkness out there. But as I look up at the sky, I think the light's winning. And that's how the series ends, right? Like, you wouldn't expect this moment of sort of like grace and insight and light in a show that otherwise was pointing in all directions toward death and darkness and despair and nihilism. And that, I think, really is indicative of where a lot of people are, whether Christian or not, in the world. And that is, man, it sure seems like things are bad. Things are dark. We hear of new shootings in schools every day. Right now there's the bombings in Austin that are, the terror attacks around the world and at home, and just all these things that are really dark and foreboding. And yet for this non-Christian TV show to dare to say, I think the light's winning, to me is a hook that every Christian should say, aha, right there, that is the Spirit of God at work. How do we say yes to that? How do we acknowledge that and go with that in ways that I think are fruitful for the kingdom?
Absolutely. You brought up a few minutes ago how you watch those shows and you're kind of the curator of the TV, and that's kind of the next question I wanted to ask was, do you feel that, or could you discuss how TV could possibly be an art?
Oh, yeah. I think increasingly it is. And I talk about it a little bit in the book, that it's a unique art in that it's highly, highly collaborative from the get-go. And I co-authored this with a friend of mine, Dean Batali, who's has been a showrunner and a TV writer for years, worked on things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and what's another one? That 70s show. He's an outspoken Christian. Has said things like, that 70s show got, I think, rated like the most crass or something like that for years in a row. And he said, yeah, but if I hadn't been there, it would have been way worse, right? I mean, these are sort of his wins. But I learned a lot from him in terms of the inside of the writer's room of how TV shows are crafted and written, especially sitcoms. What's interesting right now in terms of art, and a lot of the sort of sitcom model and older hour-long drama model was based upon the sort of economic structure of broadcast TV. Now that things are shifting towards this sort of niche or online streaming type models, the Netflix, the Amazon Primes, the Hulus, most of the money is going there, and what that's doing is opening up doors for production values to go up, for some of the constraints that the FCC would put on you are being cast off, and so if you open on Netflix, you don't have to worry about ratings or in terms of youthful or mature audiences. And in fact, you don't even have to worry about ratings. Netflix doesn't even release them at times. And so it's what's been interesting is there's been this big shift in what I would call just the industry. People that formerly would have been making movies are now making TV shows for HBO, for Netflix, or whomever, because they actually enjoy the sort of long-form storytelling that TV allows. That really, if you think about it, a 90-minute, 100-minute feature-length film is a really constricted space to tell a story. And so a lot of the artistry, I think, is shifting pretty strongly towards television nowadays. And I think we can kind of stop with the talk that it's it's whatever, the boob tube or whatever sort of pejorative thing we would call television, as if it's the less than version of what we really want, and that's the fine art of the big screen. So I actually think, in terms of artistry, it's kind of a golden age right now. Who knows where it'll go in the future, but it's quite fun that there's so many good television shows on right now. In fact, I think I put this in the book. There's more TV now made, hours of television, than there are hours in the year. So even if you wanted, you actually couldn't watch it all. Which gets back to the curating thing, where I advocate for, let's watch high quality shows, enough with the rubbish, because there's enough out there, and that usually means it's a well crafted story and has a high degree of artistry to it. That's the kind of stuff I want to invest my time in.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, we're coming up close to the end of the interview, so I guess my final question for you would be, do you have any final ruminations you'd like to leave the reader about TV and its complexity and nuances directly related to the Christian life?
Sure. Maybe one thing that I'll say that I kept coming away from, and this is something I hadn't thought about until I went into the project, and that is what's so interesting about, as you're saying, the kind of complexity of TV. In fact, one of the sources I used, the TV studies, is called Complex TV. A guy named Jason Middle wrote it, and it's really great in terms of the poetics of TV, how it tells a story, how it shapes our imagination, that sort of thing. And there's various degrees and levels depending upon, and you can read the book if you want it, or if you're interested in the complexity of it all. But I think the very nature of sort of episodic and or serialized storytelling is what I kind of walk away as I go back to the book. Now it's been a couple years since I finished the manuscript, and I go back and I kind of go, oh, I wrote that? Oh, that's interesting. And it's this notion of, as Christians, I really think that we often feel pressured when we're telling the Christian narrative, and whatever setting that is, whatever that means. We often feel pressured to tell the entire story in every telling of the story. Every time we're there, we got to get through the whole, narrative arc of God's sort of ongoing work in the world. And I think there's some real value in saying, well, wait a minute, that's not really how compelling narratives work. There is something to be said for a cliffhanger where you say, you got to come back next week, right? There's something to be said for thinking of little episodes being valuable in their own right. And a very easy analogy would be like a Good Friday service. Can we let Good Friday be Good Friday? And that the viewer, the audience, however you want to envision them, doesn't actually know what's happening on Easter Sunday. What does it mean for us to tell that Good Friday story as if it really were its own episode? Now, again, we call it Good Friday for only one reason. That's because Sunday's coming. But still, there's this element of suspense, of drama, of allowing the integrity of that episode to sort of hold up on its own. That I think sometimes we will sort of hurry past and rush through. And I'm trying to learn how to kind of rest in that tension that's left when you do encounter a cliffhanger and you don't know what is coming next. There's something powerful, I think, about that we could learn a lesson from.
Well, Kutter, thanks so much for enlightening us on TV. Sure. It's a fascinating subject. I'm sure we could talk about it all day, but then we'd have less TV time. So,
That's true. Got to get back to my show.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.